The walk we're doing there is one little bit where there is a little drop, but it's very safe. Okay, but the first thing is, okay, well, when I was 18, south of here, down where the Colo River rises, this is what happened to me. I opened my eyes to stare into deep black eyes a few meters away. Fascinated eyes, eyes of otherness. There was no fear, none at all. We watched in mutual astonishment at the incredibility of our being. We existed at this moment in time, and the gulf between our histories and separate evolution was gone. Behind us soared steep banks of sand and vertical orange sandstone cliffs. It was just on dawn. There was no thought, nothing but the startling desire to hang on to a connection that we knew could not last, holding on to our harmony for yet another unlikely moment. What do you think that might have been? Yeah, it's funny, another person suggested it might have been a snake, and I am quite close to red-belly black snakes, but no, it wasn't actually a snake. Hmm? No, it wasn't a possum. Yeah. No, not Narcissus. Wasn't a wombat, no. No, it was a native animal. The symbol of the National Parks and Wildlife Service? It's a lyrebird, yes. So now that experience, well, what it actually made me realise, see, for a moment we swapped identity is how I would explain it. It made me realise he's the world's greatest mimic that had no human voice to speak for him, and it was a him because of the tail feathers. And in fact, a few weeks later, I became the secretary of the Colo Committee that led the campaign for what is now Wollemi National Park. So it actually led me to a life experience in activism in environmental science. So I am an environmental scientist and writer, and I brought some books in here, and I'm also a conservationist. And look, I could bombard you with all sorts of facts about the environmental crisis and depress the hell out of you, but actually I'd like to talk about the land and our bond with it. So I'd actually like to acknowledge the land itself, which is so much larger and probably wiser than we are. So look into these cliffs and the other cliffs around here. We're looking at 250 million years of geological evolution. If we're looking at the world overall with landforms, we're actually over 4 billion years of geological evolution. This was once the delta on a huge braided river the size of the Brahmaputra in India that flowed down from near New England, where quite a few of you are from. So you are in fact connected to your home through the sandstone here itself. It dropped the sand that became that sandstone, was raised up and later was eroded to form these rock formations, which are actually around here known as smooth pagodas. Around 15 million years ago, to the north of here, lava gushed to the surface and laid down a major basalt flow, which is Nullo Mountain and also other basalt caps, but Nullo Mountain's actually the largest basalt flow in the whole of the Northern Blue Mountains. And it was, well, I was told it was called the centre of the world by a Wiradjuri elder, but I was told today by another that really it's the centre of the universe. And it's my home, so I sort of feel that they got that pretty right. It's an amazing place. Now we're also looking out here in what we've got with our scribbly gum and our wattles on 3 billion years of biological living evolution that's ended up with this living landscape, including one of, well actually just over there, there's Grevillea evansiana, which is a vulnerable plant. It's actually in this location, it's quite common. But when we go on, those who come on the pagoda walk, I'll show you one of the rarest plants in the world. It's Beckia Kandosii. It's actually rarer than the Wollemi pine. So we've got this living evolution around us as well as geological evolution. Now, for me, I've always tried to listen to the land And what it's taught me that we can be custodians, or a number of my Aboriginal friends prefer the term carers of the land, but in fact, on a philosophical level, we don't own the land, that it owns itself. Ownership is actually a Western idea that implies control. Now, Tecumseh was a great US Indigenous Shawnee leader who in 1810 was asked to sell his land. And his response was, sell a country? Why not sell the air, the clouds, the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? So I'm suggesting we should actually beware of the worldviews, the ethics and the ideologies that we are actually indoctrinated with by the media and corporations every day in our lives. Because if you actually do listen to the land, it will actually tell you something different. And that's actually my favourite phrase, if you listen, you will learn. And I've spent my life learning, but there is always more. I've spent over a year of my life in Wollemi. Now, Luther Standing Bear was a Dakota gentleman. He explained that the Dakota made sure their children knew that wherever they went, they would be greeted by the warm, reassuring presence of local life forms, geological features and natural forces, which were often as trusted, familiar and communicative with them as with members of their family back home. Now, through this process, Standing Bear pointed out that the Dakota children came to an early understanding that we are of the soil and the soil is of us, that we love the birds and beasts that grew up with us on the soil, and that a bond exists between all living things because they all drink the same water and breathe the same air. Now, David Moaljalai is an Garinian elder, sorry for the mispronunciation, I'm sure, from the Kimberleys. And he writes about his bonding with the land. You have a feeling in your heart that you're going to fill your body this day. Get more knowledge. You go out now, see animals moving, see trees, a river. You're looking at nature and giving it all your attention, seeing all its beauty. Your vision has opened and you start learning now. When you touch them, all things talk to you, give you their story. It makes you really surprised. You feel you want to get deeper, so you start moving around and stamp your feet to come closer and to recognize what you are seeing. You understand that your mind has been open to all these things because you are seeing them, because your presence and their presence meet together and you recognize each other. These things recognize you. They give you their wisdom and their understanding to you when you come close to them. Now, and in fact, the Wollemi Wilderness is the largest in New South Wales. There is a confusion about what the term wilderness means. That's what I did my PhD on, and actually did a lot of dialogue trying to get people to actually sit down and listen to each other, black fellas and white fellas, which succeeded, but it took 2 or 3 years, at which time most people realised that there were 95% agreement and they respected each other, so the 5% didn't matter so much. So I would suggest what we have here is a living treasure that we should be passing on, and is a deep responsibility to us all. Now, as someone who's written extensively on sustainability, there are a number of key obstacles, barriers that are holding us back from a meaningful, sustainable future. I just want to touch on 3 of them today, and then come back to how the sense of wonder relates to those, solving those barriers. One is our modernist view that sees the world as just a thing, a machine, rather than the rocks and the trees around you or the birds you can hear singing being our brothers and sisters, as our ancestors used to believe. They have become just resources for human use, something that we own. Now, this is anthropocentrism, the idea that the world revolves around humanity. It's also being very egotistic. In fact, the Greeks had a word for it. It's called hubris, overweening pride. It's also as a philosophy, leading us to disaster, I would suggest. The other's the number 2, the endless growth myth. On a finite planet, can we keep growing physically forever? What do you reckon? It's funny, I've only ever had one guy put his hand up when I asked that, and later on he said, well, actually, I thought ethics was physical. And so he was talking about ethics. So, yeah, everyone keeps seems to be saying that, and then you ask them, well, hold on, well, how come our government and our economic system is based on that idea? And then they shrug. So a child can tell you that reality. You can't keep growing forever, and yet our economy is based on that, what is really and fundamentally an absurd and insane premise. That's why we're way beyond sustainability, and it's why 2/3 of life risks becoming extinct by the end of this century. And that's right, you did hear right, we're talking about 2/3. Most people don't know that's what the estimate is. As Aileen Christ of Virginia Tech points out, the scale of what we are doing, the sheer moral evil is almost unimaginable. Yet every day we are exhorted to grow more, or for instance, anyone remember the jobs and growth slogan of the recent election? But in fact, the endless growth is the cause of the environmental crisis. We can't actually grow our way out of it when it is the cause. Number 3, denial. Not just a river in Egypt. Denial, we call ourselves Homo sapiens as a species, but we could actually call ourselves Homo denialensis. Many of us are so good at denying a reality we don't like and believing what we want to, a bit like a sulky child. Now, dialogue actually beats denial. I did have Trump's denial, but I didn't want to use that word now. It beats denial if we allow it. But it's not actually easy to get dialogue. It's not actually easy to get dialogue, and I've done it successfully about wilderness, but it took 2 or 3 years. I've tried it with population, much harder. I've tried it to do with the growth economy dialogue. That's even harder still working on the last 2. But in fact, if you do have that dialogue, you break down that denial. But you see, I think we have a tendency not to want to talk about the drivers of unsustainability, which I would suggest are overpopulation, overconsumption, and the growth economy. Now, this event is, of course, an event about getting dialogue, and so it is, again, part of that solution. But I want to come back to the land and our sense of wonder at the land. For instance, we're in Wollemi National Park. There is something of a memory lost about the fight to save Wollemi. I'm still the secretary of the Colo Committee that led the campaign in the 70s. I spent 5 years flat out working to create Wollemi National Park. It was threatened by power stations, by dams, by coal mining, by the army that used a large area around Gospers Mountain, not that far from here. And State Minister William Crabtree, the Minister of Lands at one stage, suggested we create a park 2 kilometres wide that followed the river down. Now, instead of that, we got Wollemi National Park, 502,000 hectares, containing the largest wilderness in New South Wales, 361,000 hectares. Why? Because due to overwhelming community action. We ran a 5-year campaign, we showed slideshows to 10,000 people, we took 1,000 walking into the park, and we created the pressure which, when we started, because I was only 18 when I started, and many of the Colo Committee were quite young, we thought the government would do the right thing because it was the right thing. We were naive, but we were incredibly lucky to actually get what we have here in Wollemi National Park. Now, it's, as I say, wilderness, a lot of confusion about the term. There's many different meanings. The IUCN, the International Union for Conservation and Nature's definition, is essentially a large natural area. And that's what conservationists have been talking about when they're talking about saving wilderness. And if we don't keep those large natural areas, then we have a real problem with biodiversity conservation into the future. So if we lose them, we'll get another major cascade of extinctions. And don't forget, Australia's got the worst mammal extinction record of any country in the world. Part of that reason is if you protect twice the size of an area, you actually get to save 10% more species in the long term as biogeography. Now the Great Woolemi Mountains is over 1 million hectares that we're standing in part of as Wollemi is one of the national parks of wild bush, and I'd suggest it's still very much part of the dreaming. So a sustainable future, we need to keep these areas, and only 4.4% of New South Wales is actually in that large natural or wilderness condition. So what let us continue the fight in the 70s and what lets me continue to fight today as a conservationist is the love of the land, one of the deepest loves humanity has had. Now, to be realistic as an environmental scientist, I don't actually think we're going to solve the environmental crisis without rejuvenating that sense of wonder at nature that all children feel, but gets buried during puberty and getting a job. Because if we have that sense of wonder at nature, it gives us the deep belief to make the difficult decisions we're actually going to have to make for a sustainable future, because we really haven't done much for the last 30 years. So respect and listening to the land, empathy, dediri that Miriam Rose talked about, these offer us a sense of perspective of our place in the universe, a sense of humility. We are brothers and sisters, I would suggest, to this land, not its masters. So coming back to those 3 barriers, well, if we listen to the land, we develop an ecocentric worldview. We believe we're part of nature, and nature has value and rights of its own. If we listen to the land, we see that nothing in nature grows forever. So nature shows us that endless growth is simply impossible, unethical, and actually insane. Our past cultures did try that, and they collapsed. Nature is a patient teacher. It is the ultimate reality. We don't actually create nature, it creates us. So listening helps us to break through our denial. Now, I know we have some academics here, and I'm part an academic as well, and in postmodernist philosophies, you'll often hear people say that we co-create nature. Now, a friend of mine pointed out, she said, okay, let's go to the top of that cliff and you can jump off and co-create what happens next. So I suggest that in that situation, people did realise that there is a physical reality, which is nature, of which we are a part. So the land and our bond with it is thus central, I would argue, to reaching a sustainable future. As 40 years as an environmental scientist, I am convinced of that. So although I'm a scientist, I'm also a poet. I've got a couple of books of poetry here. I'm going to finish just with a poem called The Gift. Sometimes we are gifted with a special moment, a day of meaning where all things come together and one smiles in sheer wonder. With a sudden silence, a caress of wind, and a brief ethereal ripple of light, it is as if the goddess passes and bestows a smile upon the open heart. So good to know in this teeming world so full of worries, that even now she still walks, and those who listen can still step into the eternal now. Just as Thoreau marvelled at the friendship of a pine needle, I too look out on trees, grass and sun, so suddenly enfolding, so very much kin. Thank you.